There are all kinds of shocking videos on the internet, showing people doing sick, disgusting and horrific things. For some reason, people watch the videos and then post their reactions on YouTube. Perhaps you've heard of some of the shock videos. They usually have weird titles like 3 guys, 1 crowbar, or 1 man, 1 cactus. I've watched every one of them, but today I watched one video that is more disturbing than all of the rest put together. The title is 1 guy, 2 spoons. You're probably wondering what it is, but let me assure you, it's far more disgusting than anything you can think of. It shows a man using 2 spoons to pop out his eyeballs. Yeah, he actually digs in behind his own eyeballs and pops them out of his head using the spoons. When I watched the video, I was so disturbed that I almost threw up. As sickening as the video was, I forced myself to watch it to the end. I wish I hadn't. Here's a good piece of advice for you. Be careful what you watch, because that means you can never unsee it sometimes. When the video was over, I heard my mum calling me from downstairs, telling me that dinner was ready. I raced downstairs, took a seat at the kitchen table. My father was reading the newspaper, my mother was setting the table. "That's odd," my father remarks. "This article claims there's a new viral video going around the internet. They say it's dangerous. Apparently it causes anyone who sees it to go insane and try to pop out their own eyeballs." My father broke off and looked up. "What are you doing?" my mother screams. "What are you doing? What have you done?" It was already too late. I could feel the spoons in my hands, but I couldn't see a thing. There were 2 girls named Kimi and Hu. They had been best friends ever since they started school together. When they went to university, the girls shared the same dorm room. Kimi slept in the top bunk, and Hu slept in the bottom bunk. One day, Kimi came back from class and Hu wasn't in the room. She tried to call her friend, but Hu's phone was either out of coverage or switched off. She looked around the room and noticed that all of Hu's things were still there, and her suitcase was still sitting on top of the wardrobe. Kimi began to get worried. She kept sending text messages saying, "Please call me," and "Are you okay?" But there was no reply. The next morning, when Hu still hadn't shown up, Kimi called all of her friends, but none of them had seen her. She kept calling Hu's phone, but there was no answer. Finally, Kimi sent a message asking, "Where are you? I'm really worried about you. Please text me back." That night, when Kimi was lying in bed, she received a text message. It was from Hu. It simply read, "Back to back." Kimi was stunned. She couldn't understand what the message meant. As she was puzzling it over, she noticed there was a strange, sickly sweet smell in the room. She began to look around, searching for the source of the smell. She pulled things out of the wardrobe, but she couldn't find anything that could be causing the smell. She pulled down Hugh's suitcase and opened it, but it was empty. Turning around, she looked at Hugh's bed. With trembling fingers, she reached out and pulled the covers off the bottom bunk, but there was nothing there. Then, Kimi happened to glance up and let out a horrified scream. She found herself face to face with the rotting corpse of Hugh. It turned out that an intruder had broken into their dorm room. Hugh had accidentally stumbled across him during the robbery. He murdered her and hid her body by strapping it to the underside of the top bunk. Every night, the girls had been lying back to back. It was a cold and windy night. Karen Ledger was standing on the dock, clutching her suitcase and waiting anxiously for a boat to arrive. It was dark, and she glanced around nervously. She had the strangest feeling that someone was watching her. All of a sudden, she heard a rustling noise in the bushes behind her. When she whirled around, she was shocked to see a man standing there. He was dressed in ragged clothing, and he was clutching an axe in his hands. Who are you?" she cried. "That don't matter," the man replied with a smile. "You look good. Real good. Bet you taste good too." Karen let out a horrified scream as the man raised the axe above his head. He brought it crashing down with a loud thunk. The razor-sharp blade embedded itself in her skull, killing her instantly. The man was pleased. It was a clean kill. Quickly, he grabbed her by the legs and dragged her body into the bushes. He carried her through the trees and back to his cabin, set back in a remote part of the forest. He dumped her in the bathtub, pulled off her clothes, then went out to the shed to fetch his chainsaw. It was messy work, but after a few minutes, he had chopped her body into pieces. The man roasted the legs in the oven and made a soup from eyeballs and severed fingers. Then he sat at the table and gobbled down as much as he could eat, savouring the taste of the human flesh. Later that night, while he was going through her coat pockets, he found a letter. As soon as he read it, his eyes grew wide and his face went pale. Dear Miss Ledger, your test results came back. We regret to inform you that you have leprosy and it is contagious. We have arranged for you to be treated at a special isolation clinic. It is located on a remote island off the coast. A boat will meet you there at the dock on Friday at 9 p.m. Please make sure you are there. My stepfather always hated me. When my mother married him and he moved into our house, my life became a living hell. He found fault with everything little that I did and was constantly shouting at me and calling me names. In his eyes, I could never do anything right. Pretty soon, all of the chaos at home began to affect my schoolwork. I found it impossible to study and my grades started slipping. At the dinner table, I was so nervous that I hardly ate a thing. I gradually withdrew into myself and stopped hanging around with my friends. Things began to grow worse and worse. I became my stepfather's punching bag. He started beating me at the slightest excuse. He was a strong man, and I was too small to fight him off. Each punch and kick he delivered hurt me emotionally as well as physically. It wasn't long before I was diagnosed with depression, and the doctors put me on medication. Through all this, my mother stood by and refused to intervene. She chose her new husband over me. That hurt me more than anything else. I gave up hope and prayed for the day when I could escape. One day, I couldn't take it anymore and ran away from home. I made it as far as the city when the police found me and brought me home. When they took me back to my house, my stepfather was standing at the door waiting for me. His face was twisted in anger and rage. As soon as the police left, he turned to me and said, "Did you think you could escape?" That night, he beat me twice as bad as before. I cried myself to sleep. After that, the violence escalated. Every evening when he came home from work, I tried to avoid him, but it was no use. He began inventing excuses to beat me. I never understood how anyone could be so mean and cruel. It seemed like it was all a big game to him. Each time he hit me, I could see how much he was enjoying it. My body was covered in bruises and it hurt to breathe. Eventually, he went too far. One evening, he beat me so badly I couldn't move. I just lay on the floor of my bedroom staring at the ceiling. I didn't know it at the time, but I was bleeding internally. My mother begged him to bring me to the hospital, but he just ignored her. He said I was faking it. During the night, I lay on the floor of my bedroom, moaning in pain and slowly slipping into unconsciousness. The next morning, my mother came in to check on me, but by then, I was already dead. Time passed. I don't know how much time passed. Suddenly, I saw a bright light. I heard a voice announce, "It's a healthy baby boy." I started crying loudly. Slowly, ever so slowly, I opened my eyes. A man and a woman were staring at me. They were smiling from ear to ear. The man leaned down and touched my cheek. In a gentle voice, he said, "Did you think you could escape?" There was a 15-year-old girl named Chloe who created an account on Instagram. She always took pictures of herself at school and at home and posted them online. Chloe spent a lot of time trying to get as many followers as possible on her profile. She would browse through others' users' accounts and leave a comment on their photos, saying, "Please follow me. I'll follow you back." One day, when she was looking for new followers, she came across a strange profile. It was a man who took pictures of dismembered dolls. He never showed his face in any of the photos. As usual, Chloe left a comment on his photos. "Please follow me. I will follow you back." An hour later, the man followed her account. He left a comment on her latest photo saying, "I'm following you." Whenever she posted a new photo, he would always leave the same comment, "I'm following you." She never understood it, but she didn't care. Chloe was obsessed with gathering as many followers as possible and getting as many likes as she could on her photos. One night, when her parents had gone to the supermarket, Chloe got a picture sent to her Instagram account. When she opened the photo, she realized it was a picture of her sitting on her bed. All of a sudden, she was paralyzed by fear, and she began to feel a terrible chill take over her body. She heard footsteps approaching, and a gravelly voice behind her said, "I'm following you." There was an old man who caught frogs. Every morning he would go down to the field near his house and squat down on the edge of the pond. Whenever an unsuspecting frog came hopping out of the water, the old man was ready with his net. Before it could leap away, the old man would swipe out with his net, capturing the little creature. Then, he would take a needle out of his pocket and drive it through the little frog's brain. killing it instantly. He put every dead frog he caught into a big glass jar and took them back to his house. When he got home, he would take a sharp knife from the drawer and begin skinning the frog with great care and patience. Taxidermy was his hobby, and stuffing frogs was a painstaking business. He would stuff their bodies with cotton wool, sew them up and dress them in tiny coats and hats. When he was finished, he would frame the frogs and hang them on his wall. Whenever he held a party, the old man would show off his collection of frogs. Most of the guests laughed at the dead frogs frozen in funny poses, wearing their little costumes. Now and then, someone would say it was horrible to treat animals in such a way. Whenever one of his guests complained like that, the old man would just laugh. Early one morning, just before dawn, the old man got out of bed, put on his clothes and sent off for the morning. The sky was still dark, and in the distance, he could hear the sound of croaking. It sounded like hundreds of frogs, all croaking together. When he reached the pond, the sound of croaking suddenly ceased, and everything was deathly still. He crouched down beside the pond. He held up the net, ready to strike if he saw anything move. He shivered and waited. The surface of the water was dark and murky. Suddenly it began bubbling softly. He could smell a horrible stench, like rot or decay. There was a great big bloop, followed by another, and another. Big patches of slimy weed were floating to the surface. The whole pond seemed to be bubbling with foul-smelling gases. Then, he heard a dreadful slobbering sound and the obnoxious fumes came over him. As he began to lose consciousness, he felt something pull the net out of his hands. He screamed, but there was no one around to hear him. Around noon, a policeman was driving by when he caught sight of something very strange. He saw the old man crouched down on the edge of the pond, sitting very still. The disturbing thing about it was that the old man was completely naked. The police pulled over and got out of his car. He climbed over the wall and approached the old man. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" the policeman shouted. The old man didn't move. "You can't run around like this in a public place," said the policeman. He reached out and grabbed the old man by the arm. As soon as he touched him, the old man fell over and the tiny green stitches on his belly burst open. To his horror, the policeman saw that his inside had been stuffed with wet grass, reeds, and water lilies. One day, a boy was sitting in his classroom in school. He was extremely bored and was waiting for the school bell to ring. When he looked outside the window, something caught his eye. There was a photograph lying on the grass outside. When school was over, he ran outside and picked up the photograph before anyone else could see it. Turning it over in his hands, he realized it was a picture of a beautiful girl. She was wearing a white top, a short, black skirt, black tights and black shoes. For some reason, she was holding up 2 fingers. The girl was so pretty that he wanted to meet her. He showed the photograph to everyone in the school and asked if they knew her. Unfortunately, nobody recognized her. That night when he went to bed, he placed the photo on his bedside table and went to sleep. Around midnight, he woke up. There was something tapping on his window. Then he heard what sounded like giggling. More than a little bit frightened, he worked up the courage to investigate it. He jumped out of bed, went over to the window and opened it. There was nothing there. The next day, he showed the photo to his friends and neighbours and asked if they knew the mysterious girl. Everybody he asked said they had never seen the girl before. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard the tapping sound again. He looked out the window and could just make out a figure standing on the other side of the street. He couldn't be sure, but it looked like the mysterious girl in the photograph. Clutching the picture tightly, he threw on his clothes and raced downstairs and out of the front door. As he crossed the road, he forgot to look both ways and was suddenly hit by a car. The driver got out of the car and ran over to help the boy, but it was no use. The boy had been killed on impact. The driver noticed something clutched in the boy's hands. It was the photograph. Turning it over in his hands, the driver realized it was a picture of an incredibly beautiful girl. She was wearing a black top, a short skirt, black tights, and black shoes. But now for some reason, she was holding up 3 fingers. I heard this story from a bus driver in Russia. One night, he was driving the night bus from one town to another. There were a lot of passengers on this journey, and a few people were standing. One of them was an old woman, who suddenly became ill, and she started asking the driver to stop the bus. They were on a country road, surrounded on both sides by forest, so the driver told her to wait until they got to the next town. The old woman began to scream and yell, demanding that he stop right now. The driver pulled over to the side of the road and opened the door. The old woman got off the bus and fled right into the forest. The passengers waited and waited, and eventually she returned. There was someone else with her. As she emerged from the woods, they saw she was holding the hand of a little girl who was weeping. When they got onto the bus, everyone asked the girl what was wrong. She said that her mother had brought her into the forest and placed her on a high branch of a tree. Then, she put the noose around the girl's neck and said, "Sit here a little while, and when you get tired, just jump down." "But Mum," the girl said, "this rope is pressing on my throat." "Don't worry," the mother replied, "when you jump it won't hurt." The passengers were shocked and horrified. The old woman said she didn't know why, but she suddenly felt very anxious, and that was why she asked the driver to stop there. When she ran into the forest, she came to a small clearing and saw the little girl. She caught the child just as she was about to jump off. There was a red mark around the girl's neck, and she was coughing. The bus driver decided to take a detour so they could bring the child to the hospital. They drove off. They'd only gone a few hundred meters when the driver stopped again to pick up a young woman who was standing by the side of the road. When the doors opened and the young woman climbed onto the bus, the little girl stood up and said, "Mum, you said it wouldn't hurt." Lavender Town Syndrome, also known as the Lavender Town Conspiracy, the Lavender Town Tome, or the Lavender Town Suicides, is a creepypasta story about a conspiracy to cover up mass child suicides. These suicides were allegedly caused by listening to the first version of the Lavender Town theme in the Japanese version of the Pokemon Red and Green games. The Lavender Town Syndrome began when there was a peak in suicides and severe illnesses among children between the ages of 7 and 12, shortly after the release of Pokemon Red and Green in Japan, back in February 27, 1996. Rumours say that these suicides and illnesses only occurred after the children who were playing the game reached Lavender Town, whose theme music had extremely high frequencies. Their studies showed that only children and young teens can hear, since their ears are not fully developed. Due to the lavender tone, at least 200 children supposedly committed suicide, and many more developed illnesses and afflictions. The children who committed suicide usually did so by hanging themselves or jumping from a great height. Those who did not kill themselves acted irrationally and complained of severe headaches after listening to the theme. Although Lavender Town now sounds different depending on the game, this mass hysteria was caused by the first Pokemon game released. After the Lavender Tone incident, the programmers had fixed Lavender Town's theme music to be at a lower frequency, and since children were no longer affected by it. One video appeared in 2010 using special software to analyze the audio of Lavender Town's music. When played, the software created images of the unknown near the end of the audio. This raised a controversy, since the unknown didn't appear until the Generation 2 games, Silver, Gold and Crystal. The unknown translates to Leave Now. There is also said to be the beta version of Lavender Town. Listen up. Listen very carefully to what I have to say. I have something very important to tell you. I've never really believed in the supernatural, but lately something very strange has happened to me. It all started a few weeks ago. I was standing in line at the supermarket, and I noticed that the woman on the checkout was staring at me. Her lips were twisted into an eerie smile. I tried to ignore her, and just paid for my groceries. That's when it happened. As I was leaving, she said, "Have a nice day." For a moment, I just stood there in complete shock. I couldn't believe what had just happened. The second time, I noticed it. I was walking down the street. There was a man coming towards me. He was staring directly at me, and he was grinning from ear to ear. It was that same eerie smile. As he passed me, he said, "Good morning." I stopped in my tracks and stood there trembling, unable to believe what was going on. Since then, other people have spoken to me. I'm beginning to think I'm losing my mind. I even went to the doctor. He told me it wasn't possible. He said it couldn't happen, but yet I know it is happening. You may be wondering why I'm so frightened. You may think I'm overreacting, but here's the problem. I shouldn't be able to hear anything at all. You see, ever since I was born, I've been completely deaf. A mother and daughter were travelling together in Europe. When they arrived in Paris, they booked into a luxury hotel. The mother was feeling quite poorly and decided to go to bed early. The daughter was a little worried and sent for the hotel doctor, who examined the mother and wrote out a prescription. The daughter then set out into the city to find a pharmacy and buy medicine for her mother. What should have been a simple errand ended up taking the daughter almost 4 hours. mainly because she spoke little or no French. She searched the entire city and eventually managed to find a pharmacy that was still open. Finally, the frustrated daughter arrived back at the hotel with the medicine, only to discover that her mother's room was completely empty. It was as if her mother had just vanished into thin air. In fact, the whole hotel room looked different. The carpet, the wallpaper, and the curtains all had different patterns. The bed was made and looked as if it had never been slept in. All of their luggage was nowhere to be found. And the confused daughter stopped a cleaning lady in the corridor and asked where her mother was. She was met with a blank stare. In fact, all of the hotel staff denied ever seeing the mother and daughter before. The hotel manager even said he had no record of ever seeing them or checking them into the hotel. At this point, the daughter became frantic and she fled to the embassy, where she was greeted by sympathetic officials who wouldn't believe her story. Instead, they doubt that her mother ever existed and decide that the daughter must be crazy. Trapped in a nightmare, the young girl ended up being sent to a mental hospital, where she died years later, completely insane. A few years ago, I travelled to South Korea to teach English. I was living in an apartment which I shared with two Korean girls named Mi-sun and Hwa-young. One night, we went to a nightclub. The two girls and I had some drinks and danced for hours. At the end of the night, we decided to get a taxi home. Outside the nightclub, I waved at a yellow taxi that was passing by. It stopped and we got inside. I was sitting in the front seat and my two friends were sitting in the back seat. The taxi driver was an odd fella. He spoke very good English and began telling us some jokes. He was actually quite funny, and I found myself laughing at everything he said. When I glanced behind me, I noticed that Mi-sun and Hwa-young were not laughing at all. In fact, they were sitting there, stone-faced, with a really odd expression on their faces. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Why aren't you laughing?" They wouldn't answer me. Instead, they sat there in the back seat, staring straight ahead. Suddenly, Hwa-young leaned forward and said something to the taxi driver in Korean. He pulled over to the side of the road, and the two girls got out of the yellow taxi and started walking away quickly. I was puzzled. This wasn't our stop. In fact, we were nowhere near our apartment. I paid the driver and ran after the two girls. "What's the matter?" I asked when I caught up with them. They turned to me, their faces white with fear. "We have to call the police," said Hwa-young. "Didn't you hear it?" said Mi-sun, coming from the trunk of the taxi. A woman's voice saying, "Please help me. Please help me." Two men, named Banner and Griswold, were hitchhiking on a lonely country road, but no cars would stop for them. They were tired and sick of walking. The sun was setting fast and they needed to find a place to spend the night. They came across an old, deserted house and decided to take shelter inside. The garden was overgrown with weeds and bushes. The front door creaked open on rusty hinges and a carpet of dust lay on the floor. The two men took some tins out of their backpacks and ate a small meal. Then, they unrolled their blankets on the floor, made themselves comfortable, and fell asleep. In the middle of the night, Griswold suddenly awakened from a troubled sleep. It was dark and he was shivering with the cold. All of a sudden, he heard a strange noise. It was a high-pitched whistling sound. Just then, he noticed his friend. Banner was standing in the shadows, listening intently. It looked as if he was in some kind of trance. Then, the man began walking slowly up his stairs, his boots clomping on the wooden steps. The shrill whistling grew louder. Griswold wanted to call out to his friend and tell him to come back, but the words died in his throat. Banner kept walking up the stairs and eventually disappeared from view. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped and Griswold held his breath. He waited and waited. Then, he heard an awful scream that split the silence of the night and almost made him jump out of his skin. Then, the footsteps resumed and came back down the stairs. Griswold was trembling with fear as he saw a pair of boots walking slowly down the stairs. In the moonlight, he could see a groping hand on the banister. A ghastly chill ran down Griswold's spine when he saw the other hand. It was clutching a bloody hatchet. Then he caught sight of his friend's face. It was deathly pale. His eyes were glazed over and his mouth was twisted in a ghoulish grin. Blood was dripping down his forehead from a huge gash that had almost split his skull in two. Griswold let out a blood-curdling shriek and fled from the house. He ran blindly through the pitch-black night, desperately trying to get away from the old house. He ran and ran, all the time imagining his friend chasing him with his bloody axe and his bloody head and his ghastly death grin. He ran and ran until he collapsed, exhausted. In the morning, he managed to find a police station and told the sheriff what he had seen. Together they went back to the old house to check it out. Griswold's blood ran cold at the thought of what they might find. The sheriff opened the creaking door and looked inside. Griswold peered nervously over his shoulder. On the floor he saw his friend. Banner was lying face down in a pool of blood, his head almost cleaved in half. His dead hand was still clutching the handle of the hatchet. The blade of the hatchet was embedded in the floor, at exactly the same spot where Griswold's head had been lying the night before. The sheriff searched the house from top to bottom, but he didn't find another living soul. One dark night, a 15-year-old girl named Lydia was walking home from her friend's house. She turned down a narrow street to take a shortcut, and was startled by the sight of an old man standing in her path. When she stopped, the old man turned to her and in a hoarse voice said, "Tell me the way." His face was disgusting, his skin covered in scars and boils, his hair stringy and unkempt, his eyes bulging horribly, almost popping out of their sockets. Lydia was terrified. She was alone in a dark and narrow alleyway with a strange and disturbing person. Her heart began pounding, and took her a few seconds to catch her breath. "Tell me the way," the old man demanded. Okay, where are you going?" asked Lydia, nervously. When the old man told her the address he was searching for, a chill ran down her spine. It was her house. "I don't know where that is," she replied curtly, as she pushed past the old man and ran down the alleyway. Glancing back, she could see him standing in the alleyway, watching her flee. Lydia was so freaked out by the incident that she didn't stop running until she got back. Breathing a sigh of release, she took out her keys. She looked up and down the street to make sure the old man hadn't followed her. It was empty. She turned the key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. From the darkness inside her house, a hoarse voice said, "Tell me the way." One cold evening in December, a girl invited a group of friends over to her apartment for a party. There were 5 boys and 6 girls. They put on some music, cleared a space in the living room, and began dancing. They were all having a really good time until they heard a loud bang outside. The friends all turned round and were astonished to see the figure of a man standing at the apartment window. It was freezing outside and the window was covered in frost, so they could only just make him out. His shadowy hand pounded against the icy apartment window. One of the boys shut off the music and shouted, "What? What do you want?" Through the frosted window, they could hear the man yelling, "Keep it down in there. Don't you know what time it is?" The boys and girls all apologized, saying, "Oh, sorry, we'll be quiet." They watched as the shadowy figure moved on and disappeared. One of the boys turned up the music again, full blast, saying, "Screw that guy, he's not the boss of me." All of the friends began laughing, all except one. The girl who owned the apartment was silent. She was deathly pale, and tears were streaming down her face. "What's wrong?" they all asked her. "Why are you crying?" "Why aren't you laughing?" said one of the boys. "Why so serious?" asked another friend. "Are you afraid he's going to call the cops on us or something?" said another. It's not that," replied the girl. "You guys realise, don't you? That man was at the apartment window. But I live on the 4th floor." A young woman was walking down the street when she saw an old blind man coming towards her. He was stooped over and wore glasses and a cane. He seemed to be having trouble walking, and when he was passing by her, he almost fell over. She grabbed his arm and steadied him. He thanked her for her kindness. Then he asked the young woman if she could do a favour for him. "Could you deliver this letter for me?" the blind man said. "I'm old and disabled, and I have a terrible time finding my way around the city." Being a nice person, the girl agreed to help him, and he handed her a letter with an address scrawled on the front. As the young woman turned to walk away, she happened to glance back and saw the blind man walking down the street quite quickly, with his cane tucked under his arm. Then, to her surprise, the blind man took off his dark glasses and casually tossed them into a garbage can. Suspicious, the woman took the envelope to a nearby police station. The police went to the address on the letter, which turned out to be a butcher's shop owned by an old couple. All seemed perfectly ordinary until the police asked the old couple to open the large refrigerator in the back of the shop. The old couple refused, so the police had to break it open themselves. Inside, they were confronted by a horrible scene. There were dead bodies strung up on meat hooks and shelves stacked high with chunks of human flesh. Until now, the police had overlooked the letter which a mysterious blind man had given the woman. When they opened the letter, a piece of paper inside contained one chilling line. "This is the last one I'm sending you today. Remember that." A woman and her husband were at home one evening when they heard a knock on the door. They were surprised because it was late and they weren't expecting any visitors. The woman got up to answer the door, and when she opened it, she found a strange man standing there on the doorstep. He introduced himself, saying he was a salesman. He was selling calendars door to door. The woman said she didn't need anything, but the man wouldn't take no for an answer. He kept pressuring her to buy one of his calendars, and eventually she got so fed up, she yelled at him to go away and slammed the door in his face. The next evening, when the woman came home after a long day at work, she saw something sitting on the kitchen table. It was a calendar. She picked it up and saw that one day in particular had been circled with red crayon. It was the date of her husband's birthday. When she took a closer look, she realized that the red mark was not crayon, but dried blood. Just then she heard a strange noise. She looked around. It seemed to be coming from the hall closet. Slowly, she reached out, grasped the handle and opened the door. She screamed in horror at what she found inside. Wedged in between the coats was her husband. He had a rope around his neck, and he was hanging from the closet railing. He had been murdered. The sound she heard was his feet bumping against the closet door. There was a 19-year-old Korean girl named Hakuro who was attending university in a large city. One night, she had to stay late in the library to finish a project, and it was almost dark by the time she returned home. Hakuro lived on the 14th floor of an old apartment building. She stood in the entrance and pressed the button to call the elevator. She always hated coming home alone so late in the evening. It just didn't feel safe. When the elevator came, she stepped inside and pushed the button for her floor. Just as the doors were about to close, a handsome man came running up. The man was out of breath and put out his hand to stop the doors closing. Then, he stepped into the elevator and stood beside her. "You live on the 14th floor?" he asked, seeing the button lit up. "Yes," replied Hakuro. "Oh," said the man, smiling. "I live on the 13th. As the elevator ascended, he pressed the button for 13. Through the windows in the elevator door, Hakuro watched the floors go by as they both stood in silence. She stole a few glances at the man. He certainly was handsome in her opinion. She wondered if he would ever be interested in dating her. When he happened to look at her, she battled her eyelids and smiled sweetly at him. Just then, the elevator stopped at the 13th floor. The doors opened and the man stepped out. "See you later," he said. "Yeah, see you," replied Hakuro. As the doors of the elevator were closing behind him, the man suddenly turned around, pulled a sharp knife out of his jacket, and said in a menacing voice, "Upstairs." Then, laughing like a maniac, he ran towards the staircase. The girl was terrified, but before she could do a thing, the door shut and the elevator began to ascend. She began to panic. Desperately, she hammered the buttons with her fist, trying to get the elevator to stop. There was no use. When it reached the 14th floor and the doors opened, the man with the knife was already standing there, waiting for her. In Korea, people say that this is a true story. The girl was found dead, stabbed to death in the elevator. People say that the worst part was the death herself, but other the sheer horror when she was trapped in the elevator and that she knew that she was going to die. They claim that this is the reason that all of elevators now have a stop button. A few years ago, there was a lady who lived near a mental hospital. One night, she was at home watching TV, waiting for a phone call from her brother. He was flying into town to meet her and was going to call when his plane landed. It was a very stormy night. Suddenly, the television program was interrupted by a news bulletin. The newsreader said that a crazy woman had escaped from the local mental hospital. The doctor said that the crazy woman was very dangerous. She had killed 12 people before and was sent to the mental institution for it. They also said she was obsessive compulsive and was obsessed with light switches. The woman was distracted by her phone ringing. It was her neighbour from across the street. He told her that her upstairs light in one window kept flickering on and off. The lady thanked her for letting her know and hung up the phone. She thought it was probably just an electrical problem, decided to go upstairs and check, just in case. In the darkened hallway, through the crack under the door, she saw that the lights in one bedroom were indeed flickering on and off. Gripping the door handle, she opened it cautiously. The room was empty. The fan in the room was on, and was blowing a coat hanging beside it. The coat kept knocking the light switch on and off. Relieved, the lady turned off the fan and went back downstairs. A few minutes later, there was a knock on her door. It was her neighbour again. He told her that the lights upstairs were still flickering on and off. This time it was in a different window. Together, they went upstairs to check it out. When she opened the door of the room, the lady found it empty. The lights were off. Her neighbour stepped into the room and began switching the lights on and off again and again. At this point, the lady decided that her neighbour must be imagining things, so she thanked him and escorted him downstairs. After he left, the phone started ringing. Her brother called to tell her he had arrived at the airport. "You don't need to pick me up," he said. "I'm getting a taxi. I'll be there in about half an hour." Then, on the line, she heard a raspy female voice say, "I'll see you soon." 1 dozen eggs, 1 pound of butter, because my husband loves the omelettes I cook for his breakfast. 1 gallon of milk, because we have 3 children, they're a handful. 1 bottle of Valium, sometimes I have to take something to deal with the stress. 1 bottle of vodka, a 6-pack of beer. My husband is an alcoholic. I wish I'd known that before I married him. 3 pounds of hamburger meat, 4 tomatoes, 1 head of lettuce. I spend all day at home taking care of the children. 1 box of washing detergent, 1 floor mop while my husband is out enjoying himself. 5 Weight Watchers low-calorie microwave meals. My husband tells me I'm too fat. He says I need to lose weight. 1 box of chocolates. I don't know why I should lose weight when my husband is cheating on me with another woman. 1 box of tissues. Every night I cry myself to sleep. 1 pair of gloves. They think I don't know about their affair. 1 can of antifreeze. 1 bottle of lemonade. Or if they think I'm going to let them get away with that. 1 box of rat poison. 1 box of tea bags. They have another thing coming. 1 roll of duct tape. 12 black garbage bags. They always say, "Hell hath no fury." 1 large butcher knife. 1 hand axe, like a woman scorned. 1 circular shovel. 1 saw. 1 bag of click-line. I've been lying in bed for hours. It's 5:30 now and there's nothing I can do. My parents are staring at me, but I can't bear to look at them. I'm trying not to scream. Their eyes are staring straight at me and their mouths are hanging open. I feel paralysed by fear. I can't let it know that I'm not asleep. There's nobody left to save me. I've been trying to think of a way to escape, because if I stay here, I'm going to die. It's waiting for me to wake up and see what it has done. A few hours ago, I was woken by loud screams coming from down the hallway. I got up and went to see what was going on. After taking a peek outside my bedroom door, I noticed blood on the carpet. Terrified, I jumped back into bed and hid under the covers. I tried desperately to go back to sleep, and tried to convince myself that it was just some horrible nightmare. Then, I heard my bedroom door creak open, and I peeked out from under my blankets to see what was going on. I could see something dragging 2 large bundles into the room. Whatever it wasn't human. I could tell that much. It was thin and hairless. It didn't have any eyes. It was stooped and crooked and crept noiselessly into the room. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I could make out what it was dragging. It was the bodies of my dead parents. It propped my father against the edge of the bed, and turned his face to face me. Then, it sat my mother down in the chair and positioned her facing towards me as well. Finally, it started rubbing its hands along the wall, driving something in blood. It stepped back, and I could see what it had scrawled a message on the wall. A few hours ago, it was too dark to read. The thing has been standing in the corner for hours, waiting to strike. My eyes have adjusted to the darkness, and now I can read the message on the wall. I don't want to look at it. It's too terrifying to think about. But I need to see it before I die. I peek at the message on the wall. It reads, "I know you're awake." There was a Chinese girl named Ning who had a recurring dream. Every night in her dreams, she would see a handsome boy. The boy would always beckon to her and say, "Come on, come to me. I'm waiting for you." The more she saw him, the more she fell in love with him. She came to believe he was her soulmate. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore and asked him, "Who are you? Where are you?" How can I find you? Tomorrow at 12, the boy said, at the entrance to the park. Come to me. You will recognize me by the mole on my chin. Then, Ning woke up. Her heart was filled with yearning. She decided that she couldn't pass up this chance to find her true love. She hurried to her friend's house and told her all about the dream. She begged her friend to go with her. At 11:55, the two girls were waiting at the entrance to the park. They stared at every boy who walked past and every car that whizzed by, hoping to see the boy with the mole. The weather was hot, and Ning said to her friend, "While we're waiting, I'll buy us both an ice cream." "Wait here." Ning hurried across the street to the shop, but as she was crossing, she forgot to look both ways. A car came out of nowhere and ploughed into her. Her friend watched in horror as Ning was crushed under the wheels. The friend rushed over and knelt down beside Ning's mangled body. She was lying in a pool of blood, gasping for air. The driver of the car got out to help, and the friend noticed that he was driving a hearse. Inside, a dead body lay in a glass coffin. It was a teenage boy with a mole on his chin. As the friend cradled Ning's head in her arms, she looked at her watch. The time was exactly 12. Ning took one last breath. Her heart stopped beating, and she died. A 15-year-old girl named Donna lived with her father in a small house in the suburbs. Ever since her mother died, Donna had depended on her father for everything. They had a wonderful relationship and loved each other very much. One morning, Donna's father was leaving on a business trip. As they ate breakfast together, he told her they'd be home very late that night. With that, he kissed her on the forehead, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out the front door. Later that day, when Donna came home from school, she did some homework and watched some TV. By midnight, her father had still not returned, so she decided to go to bed. That night she had a dream. She found herself standing at the edge of a busy highway. Cars and trucks whizzed by at an alarming rate. She looked across the highway and saw a familiar figure standing on the other side. It was her father. His hands were cupped around his mouth and he seemed to be shouting something to her, but she couldn't make out what he was saying. As the traffic whizzed by, she strained to hear. Her father's eyes were sad. He seemed to be desperately trying to communicate something to her. She could barely make out the words. "Don't. Open. Door." Suddenly, Donna was awoken from the dream by a strange tapping noise. Then somebody began to ring the doorbell downstairs. She scrambled out of bed and put on her slippers, and dressed only in a nightgown, she ran downstairs and went to the front door. Looking through the peephole, she saw her father's face outside. He was staring right at her. The doorbell kept ringing insistently. "Okay, hold on, I'm coming," she shouted. She pulled back the deadbolt and was about to unlatch the door when she stopped. She looked through the peephole at her father again. Something about his expression didn't look quite right. His eyes were wide open. He looked terrified. She slid the deadbolt back into place. "Dad, did you forget your keys? Dad, answer me. Dad, please, I need you to answer me. Is there someone out there with you? Why won't you answer me? I'm not opening the door until you say something." The doorbell kept ringing and ringing, but for some reason her father refused to answer. For the rest of the night, the frightened girl cowered in a corner of the hallway, helplessly listening to the ceaseless ringing of the doorbell. It seemed to go on for hours. Eventually, she fell into an uneasy sleep. At dawn, she woke up and realized that everything was quiet. She crept over to the door and looked through the peephole again. Her father was still there, staring at her. She cautiously opened the door and was confronted with a sight that filled her with unimaginable horror. Her father's severed head was hanging from a nail above the door. There was a note attached to the doorbell, in crude, scrawled handwriting. It read, "Clever girl." There was a young girl who moved with her parents to a new town. They rented a big old house that was sparsely furnished. She slept in the downstairs bedroom, while her parents slept upstairs. After they'd been living there a few weeks, their parents noticed that she was growing very thin. As the days went on, her health seemed to get worse and worse. Then, the poor girl came down with a mysterious illness and was confined to her bed. The doctor came to examine her, and he told her that she was suffering from anemia. All she needed was some rest, he said, and soon she would be as good as new. However, despite what the doctor said, her condition continued to get worse and worse. Her skin was grey and pallid, her cheeks were sunken, and there were dark circles around her eyes. Her parents were distraught and had no idea what to do. While she slept in her bed, her mother and father paced back and forth restlessly, wondering what could be the cause of her mysterious illness. Day by day and hour by hour, the poor girl grew worse and worse. She was so weak she could barely move. She was fading fast, and the life was ebbing from her veins. She was deathly pale, and her body was shriveled and withered. She started to have hallucinations, and began screaming out in terror and babbling incoherently in a weak voice. Finally, she lost consciousness and died. Her parents were inconsolable. They held a funeral service and buried their beloved daughter in the town cemetery. The day after the funeral, her parents were stripping off the sheets of her daughter's bed when she noticed something on the pillow. There were 2 red stains in the white material. When she picked up the pillow, she noticed it was unusually heavy. So she called her parents to come and take a look at it. As her parents examined the pillow closely, the mother suddenly let out a scream. She felt something moving inside it. The father fetched a knife and slit open the pillow, emptying the feathers out on the floor. As the parents watched in horror, something crawled out of the pile of feathers, slowly moving its hairy legs. It was a monstrous black spider, so swollen with blood they could scarcely make out its mouth. Night after night, as she lay in bed, this hairy abomination had been stealthily sucking all of the blood from her body, and slowly draining her life away. There was a young man who was very reckless and foolish. Sometimes for fun, he would take his father's car out without permission, and go out driving around the area even though he didn't have a driving license. One day, he was driving too fast, and as he came round a corner, the car ran up on the sidewalk. He knocked down a woman and her young son. The woman was badly injured, but her little boy was killed on impact. Her son bled to death as she held him in her arms. The young man was arrested by the police and charged with reckless driving. He claimed he wasn't guilty, even though he knew the accident was his fault. His father even hired an expensive lawyer and tried to have the charges dropped. In court, the judge said that the man could avoid going to jail if he paid a lot of money as compensation for the loss of her son. The young man agreed. However, the mother unexpectedly refused to accept any payment. "No amount of money is going to bring my son back," she said. "There is something else I want you to do for me instead." The young man was eager to avoid going to jail, so he agreed to do anything she asked. "My request is very simple," said the mother. "Once a month, I want you to send a postcard to yourself. That is all." The woman gave him a bundle of postcards. Each one had a stamp on it. She had even written his name and address in every postcard. "Please don't write anything on them," she said. "Just send them as they are." The young man happily agreed to her conditions. He was relieved that he could get away without being punished. There were 60 postcards in total. If he sent one to himself every month, it would take 5 years. Not long after that, the young man got a job and tried to put the accident behind him. However, he kept his promise, and, once a month, he mailed one of the postcards to himself. At first, he didn't mind having to do it, but every time he sent a postcard, it reminded him of the accident. He began to regret that he hadn't just paid the woman compensation so he could forget all about it. Gradually, the young man came to hate having to mail himself a postcard every month. He hadn't seen or heard anything from the boy's mother since she gave him the bundle of postcards. He decided she wouldn't know whether he was sending the postcards to himself or not, so he stopped sending them. One day, the young man took the remaining postcards and decided to get rid of them by burning them in the fireplace. However, when he picked up the postcards and held a lighter to them, he noticed something strange. There was a hidden message on each of the postcards, written in invisible ink. It read, "Die, murderer." The girl was sitting on the subway late one night, and she noticed that the woman sitting across from her was staring intently at her. The woman was sitting between 2 old men. The girl kept looking away, but the woman wouldn't break eye contact with her. The stare was beginning to freak the girl out. At the next stop, a new passenger got on. It was a tall man in a grey trench coat. He sat down next to the girl. The woman paid no attention to the man in the trench coat. She just kept staring at the girl, who was getting more and more creeped out as time went on. The 2 old men didn't even glance in her direction. She pretended not to notice, but each time she glanced at the strange woman, the stare continued. When the train was pulling into the next stop, the man in the trench coat got up to leave. Suddenly, he grabbed the girl's arm tightly, and as the doors opened, he dragged her off the train. The subway doors shut, and the train pulled off, leaving the girl alone on the platform with the man in the trench coat. She started to scream for help. "Calm down," the man said. "I just saved your life. I didn't mean to scare you, but I had to get you off that train." The woman sitting opposite you was dead, and the two men beside her were propping her up. Robert was a shy and antisocial teenager of 16, who spent most of his free time at his computer, doing what he enjoyed most, which is playing scary games and reading scary stories. His parents both worked long hours and never had much time for their son. One night, his parents went out and Robert spent the night playing games on his laptop. He had his headphones in and was listening to scary music. By midnight, his parents still not had come home, and he decided to stay up and wait for them. When he went to the sink to get himself a glass of water, when he came back to his laptop, he noticed a black spot on his computer screen. He rubbed the screen with his finger, but the stain did not disappear. Robert tried to ignore it and continued to play his game. A few minutes later, he noticed that the stain appeared to have increased in size. He wet his finger and rubbed the screen again, but the black spot wouldn't go away. The spot slowly began to increase in size, and Robert started to get scared. He removed his headphones and heard the sound of heavy breathing. A chill ran down his spine as he realized it wasn't a black spot at all. It was actually the shadow of something that had crept up behind him. It was the thing in the picture. When his parents came home that night, they found their son lying face down on his laptop. His throat had been cut from ear to ear and there was blood all over the keyboard. On the screen was the text of the story you are hearing now. How do I know this? Because I wrote this story. I am the thing in the picture. In Korea, when a patient is taken to hospital, a white wristband is placed on their left arm. These wristbands contain the patient's name and information. When a patient dies, a red wristband is placed on their right arm and they are taken to the morgue. In one particular hospital in Korea, a young doctor was working the night shift. It was around 2 AM when he finished his last operation. He was on the 5th floor and pressed the button for the elevator. The doctor was tired after a long day and was looking forward to the end of his shift. At 2 AM, the hospital was very quiet. Most of the patients were asleep and many of the nurses had already gone home. He entered the elevator and there was just one other person there. He casually chatted with the woman while the elevator descended. The elevator stopped at the basement and the door opened. They saw an old man dressed in a white gown standing there. The old man was about to get in when the doctor suddenly slammed the close button and punched the button for the 5th floor. "Why did you do that?" asked the astonished woman. "I've performed a lot of operations," replied the doctor. "I've seen a lot of people die. When a patient dies, they get a red wristband placed on their arm." The woman was silent. "You saw it, didn't you?" said the doctor. That old man had a red wristband on his arm." "A red wristband," said the woman as she raised her right arm. "You mean like this one?" In Mexico, there was a small town that had a population of less than 500. It was this kind of small town where everyone knew everyone by name and everybody knew everyone else's businesses. In this town, there lived two young boys who were twin brothers. Their mother never disciplined them and the two boys were constantly misbehaving. Everyone in town knew of them. They were nicknamed the Evil Twins because they were always the cause of everything bad happening. They even suspected of killing some of the cats and dogs in the village, but the police would never prove it. One Sunday, an old man died in his home. While the priest and the undertaker were outside waiting to transport the body to the cemetery, the twins peeked in the back window. When they saw the corpse, they immediately wanted to take a closer look. The twin boys didn't care about disturbing the dead, so they broke into the house and started playing around with the corpse. One of the boys moved his mouth like a puppet, while the other poked his eyes out with a stick. While they were playing, the twins heard footsteps. Afraid of getting caught, they put the corpse back in the coffin, but they couldn't find a place to hide. Just as the priest was opening the door, the boys jumped into the coffin with the dead body and closed the lid. The priest and the pallbearers carried the coffin to the cemetery, where the funeral was being held. They noticed that the coffin was heavier than usual, but never bothered to look inside. Nobody realized that the twins were missing until the coffin was being lowered into the grave. That's when the mother of the twin boys appeared at the cemetery and asked if anyone had seen her sons. The funeral was halted and all the people began searching the area. Some of the men recalled the weight of the coffin when they began carrying it, and said the boys might have hidden inside. The coffin was lifted out of the grave, and the men opened the lid. Inside, they found the twin boys lying on top of the dead man. The hands of the corpse were tight around their throats. They had both been strangled to death. One evening, a young woman named Betty was home alone when she heard a knock at the front door. She opened it and found a young man standing there on the doorstep. He told her that his car had broken down and asked if he could come in and make a call because his cell phone battery had died. Betty was a friendly young woman, and she readily agreed to help him. After he made his phone call, she offered him a drink. They sat down in the lounge and began to discuss anything and anything. Their conversation continued long into the night. As it was getting late, Betty yawned and told the young man it was probably time for him to go home. However, he ignored her and continued to talk about his passion for movies. He listed all the movies he had seen recently and asked her opinion on it. He continued to talk and brought up the subject of video nasties. Betty didn't know what the term meant. He explained that a video nasty was a film in which a person was actually murdered. No special effects, no camera tricks. Everything was real. Betty began to get a little creeped out and explained that she had been terrified when she watched one horror movie in particular. It was the morbid story of a young woman who was trapped by 3 psychopaths who left the camera running as they killed her, chopped her up. The man began to talk more and more about video nasties, and the longer he spoke, the more uneasy she became. While he was talking, Betty's attention was suddenly drawn by a peculiar red glow under the jacket of her guest. Her face grew pale when she realised it was the unmistakable red light of a camera that was recording. When I was younger, there was a ruined building at the bottom of our street. All of the kids in the area kept well away from it because the rumour was that it was haunted. The concrete walls of the 2-story building were cracked and crumbling. The windows were broken and shards of glass lay all over the floor inside. One evening, as a test of courage, my best friend and I decided to explore the creepy old place. We climbed in through a window at the back of the building. The whole place was dirty and there was a layer of mud on the wooden floor. As we dusted ourselves off, we looked up and we were shocked to see that someone had written the words, "I am dead," on the wall near the ceiling. Probably just some teenagers trying to scare kids, I said. Yeah. Probably, replied my friend nervously. We explored more of the rooms on the ground floor. In the room that appeared to have once been a kitchen of sorts, we found more writing on the wall. It read, "I am in a room upstairs." We walked up the creaking stairs to the 2nd floor. I led the way and my friend followed close behind. I wasn't scared, but he was beginning to get a little scared. When we came to the top of the stairs, we turned left and walked cautiously down the narrow hallway. At the end of the hallway was a closed door with some more ominous writing on it. "You will find me in this room." By now, my friend was shaking with fear. I was quite creeped out too, but I didn't want to show it. He told me he didn't want to go any further, but I insisted, telling him that there was nothing to be afraid of. I turned the handle and the door creaked open. We stepped into the room and found it empty. There were 2 closed doors on either side. There was more creepy writing on the wall. It read, "My head is on the left, and my body is on the right." As soon as my friend saw this, he completely lost his nerve. He gave a yelp and turned to run away. I caught hold of his arm, but he shook me off and fled out through the open door. I heard his footsteps disappearing off down the hallway. I held my ground. I was determined to be brave and overcome my fear. Mustering all my courage, I opened the door on the right and walked inside. I walked to the other side of the room, and on the wall, written in tiny letters, were the words, "My body is underneath." I looked down at the floor. I was standing on some more writing on the floorboard. I stepped back and saw the words, "My head is coming from the room behind you. Turn around." I heard the door cut behind me. There was a shadow moving behind the door. Suddenly, something rolled into the room and came to a rest against the wall. It was my friend's severed head. His dead, sightless eyes seemed to stare at me. Screaming in horror, I flung myself out through the open window and fell 2 stories to the ground. I landed on my side, breaking my arm. In horrible pain, I ran home, crying and yelling for my parents. The police were called and they searched the whole ruined building. At first, they didn't find anything. There wasn't even any writing on the wall. They combed the house from top to bottom, but didn't find any traces of my friends. Then they pried up the floorboards. His body was lying underneath. They never found his head.